ladies and gentlemen. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for the honor, for the pleasure of being here, especially Professor Janusz Siladi, head of our team, Professor Vieles, and of course Professor Frenes Stancin. Thank you so much for this pleasure and honor. I would like to speak about specific issues related to legal certainty and most importantly tensions between EU law and national law. And please allow me to start with some general introductory remarks, which will have two parts. One will be historic and historical rather, and the other will have economic and demographical aspect. So starting from the historical aspect, as Professor Vieles remarked yesterday, migrations can be very beneficial, and certain lessons can be drawn from history, I believe. So there is a great numbers of migrations that could be, let's say, that could be described as having mixed consequences, positive consequences, and very negative consequences. To give one example of what I would define as mixed consequences would be medieval migrations of Germans into Polish lands, which that was very beneficial from economic point of view, contributed to modernization of the economy, monetization of the economy, but also was linked to long-lasting political and social tensions and conflicts. So that's a mixed picture there, I believe. To give an example of migration that can be categorized as generally beneficial, both for the receiving society and the migrants themselves, one could point out to interwar France, where over the period of around 10 years, about 2 million migrants arrived from countries like Poland, Italy, Spain, also Algeria. And in the beginning, like in the short term, that was also linked with xenophobia, so there was a social tension related to this migration. It's also interesting to remark that France was undergoing depopulation at the time. So one can speak about aging of society, but aging of society by itself will mean depopulation, because like if people get older, then unfortunately they die, and we will deal with the population unless some other factor will mitigate that. So that served to mitigate that. And this assimilation, at least in terms of, for example, Poles was very, in the short term, I found it surprising that Poles were described as a community then that was resistant, relatively resistant to assimilation, but in the end, they assimilated completely. So from the point of view of receiving society, receiving state, that's a success. When you have a complete assimilation of migrants. Moving on to a historical example of very, to say the least, problematic migration, one could point out to, well, it's distant history, but important, I believe, to migrations of Germanic people into Rome in the 5th century, which was connected with the collapse of the western part of the Roman state. It was not the sole purpose, but it was most likely, it's not certain of course, we're talking about history, but it was most likely one of the determining reasons of collapse of the state, collapse of society, collapse of the economy, also of a collapse in technical means. What's interesting in this context is that most contemporary resources seem to agree that this could have been avoided, that the authorities at the time had at their disposal means not to prevent this migration, because they also suffered from the problem with the population, but to mitigate it, to make it more gradual, less violent, and avoid this most serious avoid the catastrophe that it was linked with. So the lessons to be drawn from this 3 examples, there are of course many more, is that it can be very beneficial, but it can also be even dangerous, and there is this high need of sound policy in terms of migration, effective policy in terms of migration, and one should expect social tensions, at least in the short term, and these tensions could be very important. Now to shed some light from the economic and demographic point of view, to take just some issues from many important issues, labor market. So from the point of view of employers, arriving migrants as a rule will be beneficial. That increases the labor pool as a rule, not always, but this is to be expected. This will be like the typical result. So the labor pool will be increased, the cost of labor will be decreased. So from the point of view of the growth of the economy, this should be beneficial, but at the same time we will be likely dealing with more competition in the labor market, hence for the existing employees that would be problematic and contribute to social tensions. Housing. So if we have increase of migration, this will be very beneficial for the owners of houses, of apartments. This will increase the prices of real estate, or at least it's likely to increase the prices of real estate and prices of and rents, but will decrease availability of housing. So for existing tenants, this will be not beneficial, let's say it delicately, and also may contribute to social tensions. And finally, from the demographic point of view, migrations may help with aging, with the population, but cultural differences between existing population and migrants are likely to contribute to social tensions. So it's very likely that it will be linked to social tensions. The social tensions are likely to translate into political tensions, and this is likely to translate into tensions in terms of the law. And this leads us to the relationship between the EU law and national law. And the focal point of this tension seems to be the positions of the Court of Justice of the European Union and constitutional courts of member states. This relationship and these positions were very systematically discussed by Dr. Orężak yesterday, so there is no need to repeating it, but just a quick summary of some positions of specific courts. Of course, the Court of Justice stands on the position of the primacy, precedence, supremacy of EU law, and without the regard on the, let's say, rank of national law. And interestingly, this largely stems from the principle of effectiveness. So this rule is needed in order to EU law, for the EU law to be effective, the fact that large parts of EU legal system stem from rather, let's say, in a way, creative creation of certain legal principles, legal norms by the court, by a court, which is not something that continental legal systems are very accustomed to. Might be a problem in terms of tensions on the intersection between EU law and national law and legal certainty. So if we look at the positions of certain national constitutional courts, we can of course observe that often they disagree with the Court of Justice, and they stand, roughly speaking, on the position of primacy of national law, at least in the context of the Constitution. And this let's say, limit that national constitutional courts in certain countries believe exists on EU law. Is expressed, for example, one of the positions of Polish Constitutional Court. So when the court states that it acknowledges the position of the Court of Justice as being exclusively competent in terms of adjudicating in areas vested to the EU by the treaties, but while respecting constitutional identity and balancing functions of member states, as well as principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. The interpretation of EU law must not be conducted arbitrarily. So there's a problem of arbitrariness, and this, to my mind, may be linked to this important characteristics of EU law, where certain important features of EU law stem from positions of the court rather than, let's say, written law, which may give the impression, may give basis to certain activities that may seem as arbitrary or actually be arbitrary. And the court states unbreachable boundaries of interpretation of the Constitution that is friendly from the point of view EU law, and is of the opinion that interpretation of the treaties that overrides state sovereignty, threaten national identity, would be a breach of the Lisbon Treaty. So, in other words, the court is of a position that there are boundaries, the EU competencies, and that the position of the primacy of EU law is well, controversial, at least from the point of view of the Polish Constitutional Court. A position that is, like, in essence similar was taken by the Constitutional Court of Hungary, where in one of the decisions we can see that joint exercise of competences through the institutions of the Union may not lead to lower levels of protection of fundamental rights than that which is required by the fundamental law of Hungary, and the protection of inalienable right of Hungary to determine its territorial unity, population, its form of government, the structure of the state, is to be considered a part of its Hungary's constitutional identity. So again, a discrepancy between how the Constitutional Court of a member state sees the relationship between national law and EU law than that of the tribunal. Czech Republic. It seems that this problem came up as a coincidence, as an accident in Czech Republic, that it was the Czech Constitutional Court was the first to describe a decision of the CJEU as ultra vires and one that cannot be given effect in the Czech Republic. And apparently this happened by accident on the canvas of a conflict between national courts, but it did take place. And in the Czech literature, this is described as something marginal, practically marginal. However, this, let's say, this discrepancy also exists there. It's more dormant than in the situation than it is from the point of view of Poland and Hungary, but still existing. And finally, Romania. The court, among other things, stated that EU member states have decided to exercise specific powers which traditionally were ascribed to the area of national sovereignty jointly. It was described as obvious in an era of globalization that national sovereignty cannot be considered absolute without risking unacceptable isolation. So the court seen this sharing of sovereignty, let's say, as something unavoidable in the modern context. However, like the Constitution of Romania does not directly, it does, well, long story short, the position of the court is that the EU law does not stand, let's say, above the Constitution of Romania, but it does stand above laws that are lower in the hierarchy of laws than the Constitution. So this seems to be a more friendly approach to the EU, but still this dormant conflict exists there. And of course there are many other examples, and this problem is being articulated more or less acutely by different constitutional courts. So in normal circumstances, this is not a huge problem as long as there is a basic consensus among member states and the EU. If there is this basic consensus, these conflicts they will not flare up, and this paradox, so to speak, won't be visible. But if there are some contentious issues, such as migration, which is which is quite concessions and is connected to again, social tensions translating into political preferences. This translates into election results, and election results will translate into the letter of the law, but also very often this has effect on the composition of constitutional courts, and as an effect will have an effect on composition will translate into position on constitutional courts. So if there is such a conflict, if there is no basic consensus as to like the direction certain policies are going, what are possible solutions? And by solutions, I do not mean here like good solutions, but what may happen. So hopefully building basic consensus. So if basic consensus among the decision makers on the level of member states, including the judges, and the EU is maintained, is built and maintained, this acute crisis may not materialize. And what could facilitate this consensus building would be a lack of apparent or real arbitrariness, especially on the behalf of EU, and not only in terms of the case law of the court, but also in practical application of the EU. So if the EU law appears to be arbitrary, this is likely to undermine its authority and contribute to the crises on the line between member states and the EU. But if this basic consensus, which is difficult for an EU of 27 member states and will be even more difficult if EU were to expand, if this consensus is not maintained, it's not built, there are like two directions that I can see. One is coercion, and of course not physical coercion, but political, economic coercion, so like forcing the member states who do not agree, forcing the decision makers who do not agree to comply basically, which is, well, this is a bad solution, but it is a solution, or secession. So a member state that does not want to comply, decision makers who do not want to comply, this may result with a secession. So to bring all of these things together that are connected, I believe on a profound level. So like acute migrations are an opportunity and a danger at the same time. They are connected with, they're likely to be connected with important social tensions, which will translate into political tensions and legal tensions. And if there are discrepancies, important discrepancies between member states, this can set on fire this dormant conflict that is at this point inherent in the EU legal system in terms of the relationship of both systems of law. And this conflict is not helped, I believe, by the fact that the idiosyncrasies of the EU law, which make it a bit more similar to Anglo-Saxon system of law than the continental law in terms of how important legal norms are created, are not something natural for the member states which not have, let's say, like a common law background, and this may contribute to the sense of arbitrariness. So to just to put a finishing point to that, I think the best way is maintaining and building a consensus, but for that there need to be like two parties that are willing to find this consensus, and at this point it seems that it's a problematic situation. So thank you for your attention, and thank you so much for the very interesting presentation, because I came here to Zagreb with certain idea in my mind of what I want to talk about, but this idea was transformed as I was listening to the presentations, and I'm leaving here, I think, much wiser than I came. So thank you so much.